Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the discussion seminar for the 2022 Tanner Lectures, delivered for the past two evenings by Richard Wrangham. My name is Rob Reich. I'm a faculty member in the Political Science Department. I'm also the current faculty director of the Center for Ethics and Society, which is the host and sponsor of the Tanner Lectures at Stanford University. One of the distinguishing features of the Tanner Lecture is not merely that an eminent scholar comes to campus to deliver lectures on a topic concerning human values, but that the Tanner Funds provide for the appointment of equally distinguished discussants, which are built into the structure of the program. And so we heard on the first night from our Stanford colleague, Deborah Gordon, who's joined us again, professor of biology. And then last night from Lisa Lloyd, distinguished professor from Indiana, and we'll invite them back into the conversation today at the formal discussion seminar if they wish to join. The format for today will be that we'll have two additional discussants. I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. They're sitting in the front of the room. Richard Wrangham is sitting next to me. He'll have a chance then to respond to some of the comments offered by our two discussants. And then as host and moderator, I'll throw it open to wider discussion. Also now signaling to the people who are joining us via Zoom, you can feel free to add your comments, ideas, and questions to the chat, and I will try to filter those into our conversation as well. So let me introduce to you our two discussants for today, having expected that you were present for at least one of the previous two lectures by Richard, who then won't need another introduction today. Ian Morris, who will speak first, is a professor of classics here at Stanford University. He's primarily a historian and archaeologist, and he began his career studying the rise of the Greek city-state, then moved on to ancient economics and now works on global history since the Ice Age. He's published 14 books, and among them are the recent and impressive Why the West Rules for Now, the Patterns of History and What They Reveal About the Future. He's the author, perhaps, in my view, maybe most closely related to the topic of the lecture here today, of a Tanner lecture himself, delivered, actually, I don't know where you delivered them at Princeton, but the title of those Tanner lectures were Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels, How Human Values Evolve. A commentary included folks like Christine Korsgaard, Margaret Atwood, and Steve Bacido. He lives these days in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So for those of you local, you can appreciate his life in the Santa Cruz Mountains with 2 dogs, 5 cats, 2 horses, and a floating population of peacocks. And if you want actual more detail, he's published about this, a recent account in the New Yorker from last year, in which he and his flock escaped fire. I recommend the first person account to you. Our second discussant is also a Stanford colleague, Professor Richard Klein. He's the Anne and Robert Bass Professor of Anthropology and Biology at Stanford, and he researches the archaeological and fossil evidence for the evolution of human behavior. In 2002, he published a book with the title The Dawn of Human Culture, in which he provides a theory of what constituted, quote, the cultural Big Bang for humanity. And by examining archaeological evidence and neurobiological scholarship, Professor Klein argues that genetic mutations affecting the human brain had vital roles to play in the development of human culture. And in particular, he argues that a mutation in the human brain appearing 50,000 years ago facilitated the rise of abstract thought and a more full, complex language, pointing to archaeological evidence involving tools, amongst other things. He's also the author of a canonical textbook called The Human Career, Human Biological and Cultural Origins. So again, the format, Professor Morris will begin with some comments. We'll then turn the floor over to Professor Klein, invite Professor Wrangham into the conversation, and then widen. The floor is yours, Professor Morris.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks, Rob, for that very kind introduction. And I should add to the list of animals, wild pigs. We've now been running wild pigs. It's great to be here, and to be able to be here actually in person too. And so thanks to Richard Wrangham for these great lectures, and to Deborah and Lisa for their responses, to the Tanner Foundation for putting all this on, the President's Office, the Tanner Committee for inviting me, and to the people who made my vaccine at Moderna, which allows me to come here in person. So thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to try 2 points this morning, one archaeological and one historical. And I doubt that either of them is going to be new to Richard, but I would like to hear what he got to say about them. And Richard Klein as well. I have a few things to say about them. So the Tanner lectures, I mean, this is a thing about human values, about moral philosophy. So you do Tanner things, you find yourself plunged into this group of philosophers. And last night at dinner, it occurred to me, I was actually plunged into a circle of biologists. I was surrounded by biologists. And so I thought, it seemed very fitting, I should start. I started thinking about this last night. I got, what am I going to say? I started thinking from a philosophical paper about animals. That seemed like a really good starting point. Bats in particular. A very famous paper by Thomas Nagel called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And I'm sure many of you will have read this. And his answer is, basically, we can't know. We can know what bats do. We can talk about what bats do. They hang upside down. They eat mosquitoes. They carry rabies. They navigate by echolocation. We say all kinds of stuff about this. But we can't know what it's like being a bat, because that would require a bat mind. And you can only have a bat mind if you've got a bat brain. And all of you lot, sadly, do not have bat brains. You've just got human brains and human minds. So you can never know what it's like to be a bat. It's this classic paper on the philosophy of mind. But it always seemed to me Nagel kind of gave himself an easy job in writing this paper, because a bat is so different from a human, so alien. We all agree, yeah, you can't know what it's like to be a bat. I think it'd be a much more interesting question. What is it like to be a Homo erectus or a Neanderthal? That, I think, is a much more interesting question. And some of you, I'm sure, have read William Golding's novel, The Inheritors, about what it's like to be a Neanderthal. That's one of the great, weird, great novel. And basically, I mean, I wonder, is it Homo erectus, are they so alien that we can never know what it's like to be a Homo erectus? Or are they sort of basically just like us with a few more rough edges? And it's sort of alarming actually to talk about human evolution in front of either of these Richards, I should say. So you should feel very sorry for me. Slightly reckless, but I never let recklessness stop me in the past. But anyway, when I was an undergraduate, pretty generally my professors would have said Homo erectus was toward the bat end of the spectrum. We could not know what it's like to be a Homo erectus. They're so different from Homo sapiens. Nowadays, archaeologists generally say the opposite, that Homo erectus is not that different from us. Neanderthals, even less so. And this, thinking about this, excuse me, choking on my baked goods, made me wonder whether Richard Wrangham was perhaps in his lectures somewhat guilty of sapiens exceptionalism, speciesism. I don't know if that's a word, but maybe you have committed the crime of speciesism, which I'm sure can get you in a lot of trouble. Just at the moment that archaeologists have kind of turned strongly against sapiens exceptionalism. And like Richard was telling you, so sapiens like, skeletons like the one you brought along inside your body today, these have been around going back 300,000, slightly more years. And right around the time we see the first sapiens-like skeletons, the big domed heads and all these things, we also see this slew of archaeological changes at about the same time. Levallois tools, amazingly clever tools people start making. Stockpiling of red ochre, which a lot of people think was used to create art, and this is something rather distinctively new. Fire, and again, I'm talking about fire in front of Richard, which makes you slightly nervous, but fire, been around a really long time. But it's around 350, 250,000 years ago, fire starts becoming ubiquitous, and pretty much all archaeologists think people can now make fire at will. Now, all of these things began well before Homo sapiens came along. Levallois type tools, art type activity, fire use, certainly about 500,000 years ago. So they're not, it's not like sapiens invented these things originally. So, and it's not like the spread of them can be put down entirely to sapiens either, because they show up 300,000 years ago, well beyond the range of Homo sapiens. Other kinds of Homo are doing these things. And then when we get a bit closer in time, after about 100,000 years ago, we can now see all kinds of parallels between sapiens and Neanderthals in their cultural behavior. Arts-like activity, maybe music activity, counting, making basketry and things out of fibers. This is amazing site, Bruniquel in southern France, 170,000 years ago. Neanderthals performing what really does look to be ritual activity, some concept of another world, supernatural world, deliberate burial of the dead, all of that entails. Sapiens and Neanderthals seem to be doing this stuff kind of in parallel for tens of thousands of years. And archaeologists have moved in a big way in the last 20 years towards saying that multiple kinds of Homo are all evolving toward having a cognitive capacity for cumulative cultural evolution by about 300,000 years ago. And what they mean by that is lots of species of animals have culture of some kind. Crows have it, some people say pigs have it, and all kinds of animals have cultural behavior of some kind. But it seems like only Homo, only humans have the capacity to add tweaks generation after generation, ratcheting up culture to create something that no individual could actually learn from another individual. This is a cumulative production input of lots of people. No individual just wakes up 300,000 years ago and invents a laptop. You can't do that. You've got to have, there are hundreds of thousands of years in that case of cumulative cultural evolution. Only we can do that, it seems. And increasingly, archaeologists are now saying that the explosion of cumulative cultural evolution 40, 50,000 years ago, it's not because of a cognitive revolution in sapiens, it's because of demography. That for tens of thousands of years, the learning populations are not big enough to innovate and above all communicate ideas faster than ideas get lost because of mistakes in copying and group extinctions. So we just don't see a cumulative cultural evolution actually happening on the ground. And this theory, the demographic theory, says sapiens replace all other kinds of Homo, not because we're smarter than Homo erectus or Neanderthals or anything else, but because we're more genetically diverse and we're faster breeding. That's why we inherited the earth and they didn't. So it just seemed to me obvious question, if multiple kinds of Homo are all evolving similar cultural capacities round about 300,000 years ago, why apparently did sapiens alone come under selective pressures favoring domestication and gracilization and the biological evolution of groupishness and targeted cumulative killing? And maybe there's a good reason, and Richard will explain this to me. Richard suggested in the answer to one of the questions, I think it was after one of his talks, that speech is one of the big things making sapiens go off in a different direction. I don't think many archaeologists would now buy that. So this is the question. It seems to me something's missing here if the thesis is to convince many archaeologists. So I would like to hear more about that. But second point, quick point. This one is about biology and history, genes and culture. Coming from a humanities department, I am sort of expected to say something about these things. This, I think, already came up both in the commentaries and in the questions of the relation between biological and cultural evolution in this story. And in his publications, Richard does have a lot more to say about culture, but the talks, I think, did make it sound a bit like groupishness and targeted coalition killing and so on are biological adaptations. They get hardwired into humans, and the story is kind of over after 300,000 years ago. We are what we are. I know that's actually not what Richard thinks, but that kind of was how it sounded a little bit. I guess I would say the only thing that was hardwired into us was the capacity for cultural cumulative evolution, the flexibility to respond to the world in ways that no other animals that we know of can do. And I was wondering sort of where this was in this story. It seemed to be, we heard a lot about genes, but not much at all about culture. And I got thinking about this last night. Maybe I was doing this thinking too late in the evening, because this doesn't now seem like it totally makes sense, but never mind. Richard was telling us there are no more alpha males in the sense of males who rise to the top of the pile by violent domination of other males, get to the top by beating everybody else up. They've been weeded out by natural selection. Well, all I can say is, Richard, you did not go to my high school. In my high school, we had a lot of violent alpha males. But one of the things I learned in high school is that violent alpha males and coalition builders are not mutually exclusive categories. They are competing strategies for domination that different people deploy in different ways, depending on their innate abilities and the niches they find themselves in. Only an alpha male could head up a group that was like a serious player in the schoolyard. But on the other hand, you couldn't run a group that was a serious player in the schoolyard by acting like an alpha male. And it's like this is old Han Dynasty Chinese saying, you can conquer an empire from horseback, but you must dismount to rule. And that was my experience in high school. You're not going anywhere unless you can stand toe-to-toe with somebody. But just standing toe-to-toe is not going to do the job. And fortunately, of course, you don't need to be killed to learn that you can't go around acting like an alpha male. I think this is the whole point of the reverse dominance hierarchy, it seemed to me. Is it actual coalition killing? That's a really extreme case. I mean, that doesn't happen all that much, despite the 24% figure in the now paper. You learn what pays and what doesn't. And that's why we see change, because this came up in one of the questions yesterday. Why has it changed? Because your talk didn't seem to incorporate a mechanism for the cultural changes that we do see. This, I would say, this is why it's changed. That patriarchy, slavery, religious, racial, gender hierarchy, deference to the strong, these have really collapsed in the last 250 years. As you were saying yourself in your response, these have collapsed in this way that would have seemed like magic 500 years ago. We ratchet up our culture in response to the environment that we live in. We reconstruct our niche in that process, which changes the environment and then changes our further reactions to it. And I think what we're so good at as humans is responding to making cost-benefit analyses of new niches and adapting our culture to fit what looks like it's going to pay off. And so patriarchy and slavery and the rest been around a very long time, but they do spike up spectacularly about 12,000 years ago when farming comes into the world, because they work so much better in this new niche that humans have created. Collapse again about 250 years ago, because they just don't work so well in a world that's had this energy bonanza unleashed by fossil fuels. And a part of this collapse of deference is that humanists no longer always feel it's necessary to defer to the scientists now. And I would say you just can't do this sort of long-term history by looking back 10,000 or 300,000 years and then jumping to now as a just so, look, it's all set so long ago in the past. You've got to tell the continuous story, deploy the old-fashioned tool of historical narrative, going back to Herodotus and Thucydides. These guys knew a thing or two. And when you do that, I think you're forced to confront the interaction of the genes and the culture a lot more. So anyway, that's what I think. I will stop there. So thank you again for the lectures. I thought these were great.
Wonderful. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Professor Klein.
Okay, I have to tell you, I think I'm out of my depth here. I thought that was true when I was asked to be a commentator on this a long time ago. I study old bones and stones, and I'm very focused on the nuts and bolts, which is what I think of that. I don't have big ideas. Richard's idea is a big idea. I've never had one like that. I've always worried that I couldn't relate what I do to anything like a big idea. You have to, among other things, formulate hypotheses that can be falsified. So is there something in the archaeological record that Richard thinks would falsify what he believes about human self-domestication, the evolution of societal patriarchy? I don't see anything. Let me tell you what I think. It's quite different from what Ian said and what Richard said about human evolution. If you go back to 300,000 years, there's a skull from Morocco that anticipates, it's not a modern skull, not even close, but it anticipates modern human skulls far more closely than things from Europe, which anticipate the Neanderthals. It makes it clear that modern humans, we have this from genetics too, evolved in Africa while other kinds of people were evolving in Eurasia. There's no behavioral break at 300,000 years, no difference between the artifacts that were made before 300,000 years and afterwards. We get a behavioral break, a really dramatic one, about 50,000 years ago. It happened in Africa, which makes sense because that's where modern humans were evolving. And suddenly, what do you have? You have much larger populations, a much enhanced ability to hunt and gather, which is probably related to why we have larger populations. You get the first unequivocal art. Now, it's said that the Neanderthals made art sometimes. To me, it's the old business about how do you recognize pornography? You know what the judicial definition is? You know it when you see it. I look at these so-called art objects that Neanderthals and other people made before 50,000 years ago. They don't look art to me. They don't look like, they're not unambiguous. They're just things that people who are enthusiasts want to make into art. At 50,000 years ago in Europe, we get things that are totally unambiguous. There's a fantastic female figurine with exaggerated female features from southwestern Germany that is, unparalleled. If somebody made that today, it could go into the Met. There's nothing before 50,000 years ago that comes close. We get this sudden appearance of art, and then it it doesn't evolve in the sense that there's more primitive art and more advanced art. It's there, and then it's always there, and it's always completely sophisticated. We get this, say, change in human ability to make a living. We get other things, much larger human populations. I can document that from the work that I've done in Africa after 50,000 years ago. That's when we have this behavioral change. And it happens to have occurred among our species. And then our species leaves Africa and more or less replaces other species in Eurasia, more or less because we know there was some interbreeding and there was some leakage from the Neanderthals into our genome. Some limited, and also from Richard talked about, mentioned the Denisovans, people who lived east of the Neanderthals, some leakage from them into our genome. All right, so interbreeding was still possible, and it occurred very occasionally. Now, leakage is the word. If you were to look at people in this room, take their genes and look at their genomes, maybe 1% of the genome on average in this room could be said to be from Neanderthals. So they didn't play a terribly important role in our evolution, even if they still contributed some genes to us. I think the really striking thing about the archaeological record is what happened 50,000 years ago. This dramatic change in behavior, and with it, the out of Africa event, the expansion of modern humans to Eurasia, and a very rapid replacement of these other kinds of people. I don't know how this can be made to fit with Richard's ideas. I'm not saying it's against them, but I don't know how it can be made to fit with self-domestication or the evolution of societal patriarchy. I don't see any relationship that I can imagine. What my ideas about this break at 50,000 years, they can be falsified. You find a Neanderthal site that has nice art objects, and maybe we get some genes out of Neanderthals that indicate that they had the same cognitive and communicative facilities we do. That would falsify what I believe. We don't have the genes yet. I think we will, and that'll be very interesting to see. I think it'll turn out that if you look at genes that are known today in modern humans to facilitate our cognition and our communication, Neanderthals won't have those. And that's why they disappeared. It makes a big difference, if you have these genes, then you gather more efficiently, your populations expand. I can show that in part of Africa, I work, southwestern part of Africa, human populations were many times larger after 50,000 years than they were before. They were always small before, and I can show that too, right, leading up to 50,000 years. And then suddenly they're much larger. So that has something to do with what I think happened inside the brain. I am a long-time advocate of the idea that there was a genetic change of some kind. I don't know what it is. It's difficult to falsify that, but I think it could be falsified if we can get genetic material, genetic genes out of people in Africa older than 50,000 years. And we already have them in part from the Neanderthals. We don't have the functional genes that I think are really important to understanding Neanderthal cognition and communication. But that's the way I read the record. It's very different. And there's 300,000 years, it's one skull in Morocco. And it does anticipate modern humans, there's no question. At least it anticipates them more closely than it anticipates the Neanderthals. And we have people in Europe at the same time, 300,000 years ago, their skulls anticipate the Neanderthals. I don't think it's telling us anything about, whether they were self-domesticated or not. You look at the Neanderthals, I don't self-domesticated, I don't know, they're just people. And there's nothing, what would you predict, for example, if self-domestication is important and it reduces reactive aggression, would you expect more or less violence among the Neanderthals than among modern humans? That's something at least we could begin to test in the record. I don't see any evidence for it. I doubt that that's true. So I think if you have hypotheses like this, you have to be able to falsify them. I think it'd be very difficult to falsify the evolution of societal patriarchy in deep time. And Richard's ideas were really behind it. Not that it's wrong, but I don't know how you ever make sure that it's wrong or right. So that I think is a problem. At least my ideas, however simplistic they may be, they can be falsified. We can get ancient genes, we can get new artifacts, we can get new sites, and then you can say, no, you're wrong. There was no change 50,000. Some people actually argue that now. I think it's silly, but there was no change 50,000 years ago. It was always that way, or at least from 300,000 years ago before. This is something you can tell, but I've spent my life looking at the artifacts and bones. There is no change 300,000 years ago. There is a change 50,000 years ago, and it's really dramatic. What does it say about the evolution of societal patriarchy? I don't know. I was interested last night. It came up at the end of the lecture, and Ian just addressed it too. Is societal patriarchy really a universal? Well, it sort of is. I think if I wanted to make up a story about it, I would relate it to social sexual dimorphism, differences between the sexes that aren't necessarily directly related to reproduction, differences in size, all kinds of things that are different, that some of which we don't understand. One is, you can always tell, almost always tell, when you're talking to somebody whether they're male or female, right? At puberty, the voice box drops, and in males, that leads to deeper voices. It's a sexually dimorphic feature. Of course, there's also facial hair, a bunch of other stuff. Anyway, we have these differences between the sexes, sexual dimorphism, and out of that flows the sexual division of labor, which I think we can say was there, say 2 million years ago, when because we have the difference in size between males and females. It actually was reduced about 2 million years ago, or 2.5 million years ago, from what it was before. I have a story about that too, but I won't bother you with that. But if you wanted to talk about why we have societal patriarchy, and the fact, we have to have an explanation for why it's not disappearing today, maybe, but certainly much reduced, as the industry reported. If you relate that to the sexual division of labor, which is nowhere near as important in our society as it was in forager societies leading up to ours, where women, what do women do? They go out and they forage for plants. In my part of the world, this part of the world where I work, they collected shellfish. We have historical records indicate that they were primarily responsible for that, not males. Ethno-historic records. And of course, they're also birthing people, but they're more than birthing people. They're also nursing people, aren't they? So a woman, when she has a child, it's not just the period of gestation. It's a couple of years afterwards until that child can be weaned, and she can't do anything except drag the child around with her. Can't go out and hunt the way that men are. That won't work with the child on her back. That just won't work. And then in societies, forager societies, there's enormous emphasis on having kids. They're always on the brink of extinction. So, woman has one, get it up to weaning, and then there's pressure to have another one. And the problem, of course, is that there's very high juvenile infant mortality. If you can get to be age 6 in a hunter-gatherer society, forager society, you have a chance of living as long as we do. Into 70s, that's well established. But the infant mortality is enormous, and that was true in the past too. And I think prehistoric people focused heavily on that. One of the interesting things about this art that I mentioned, this Paleolithic art, as it's called, Upper Paleolithic meaning after 50,000 years ago, is how often female bodies, and particularly the parts that are relevant to reproduction, are pictured. Everybody probably seen representations of these, photographs, maybe drawings, maybe even the real things of these female figurines. They're spectacular things, including, let's say, the very earliest art in Europe features one. And when you look at the cave walls, they're vulvae. Is that the plural? Vulvae? Vulvas? They're everywhere. These people, you could make, if you wanted to make a story, you could say, Hugh Hefner's ancestors lived in France 50,000 years ago, and he was telling people to paint vulvas on the walls of their caves and make these beautiful Venus figurines. I don't think it's saying anything about. I don't think it's pornographic, and even remotely. I think it's telling us that they were really focused on fecundity and fertility because they were always on the edge, the demographic edge of extinction. Anyway, that's a different issue, but it may or may not pertain to the evolution of societal patriarchy. I'm sure they had it. I'm sure, based on their, which you might call their surviving descendants, the few forager societies that we could observe historically, they all had it. Since the material culture is the same, roughly, as it was after 50,000 years ago, I think we can assume that everybody after 50,000 years ago had it too. And then why is it reduced in our society? Or we're working to make it more reduced, aren't we? Makes sense. Sexual division of labor is no longer that important to us, even in terms of women being birthing and nursing people, right? Among other things, what you can do now, a woman doesn't want to get involved in nursing for a long period by formula. What did you do 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago? There was no alternative to nursing. Anyway, that's about what I have to say. What I would be interested in knowing is whether you think your ideas could be falsified by something we might find in the fossil archaeological record. I don't see how. I think mine could. I hope it won't be because I've written about this extensively, and that would be embarrassing. But that seems to me to be crucial to anything like this. That's science, isn't it? Have a hypothesis. It's only as good as it can be tested. And testing usually means, can it be falsified? Okay, I spoke enough, I think. I'm sorry, I took off the mask because I noticed you don't have to have them. I don't want to alarm people, but I've had 2 students in a small class I teach who tested positive just in the past week. So I'm trying to be very careful. I waited this morning to get back the caloric test. Hasn't come back. I feel fine. So I think I have no symptoms, so I'm sure it's fine.
Thank you. So we reserve a period of time for discussion. So Professor Wrangham, you can take the floor, but let me also just encourage, if you wish, this not just be a singular response and then open to everyone, but a discussion amongst you, at least for a period of time.
Okay, thanks. All right, so it's very daunting to be critiqued by experts in their fields, someone who's written about the ecology of values, and someone who actually knows the biological anthropology of recent human evolution really, really well. Lots of points made. I'll just sort of try and pick up on a few. So Ian, just as a very small point of clarification, you had a quick aside about speech. You said something like that I thought speech was really important.
A misunderstanding?
Yes, slight misunderstanding in the sense that I would just emphasize my point about the complexity of language. I assume the language would have been spoken, but there are other theoretical possibilities. But I'm not imagining that at the time that we're looking for a reason for selection to act against reactive aggression, that speech came in suddenly. What I'm imagining is that language has got a long history. Maybe it goes back to Homo erectus, but that for reasons that are just as mysterious as everything else connected with the evolution of language, it got to the point that the subtleties of being able to construct conspiracies in which you protect yourself from the possibility that when you suggest killing somebody else, that the person you're talking to is not going to take that information and then take it to the other person. All those sorts of complexities. That's the kind of complex language that I'm imagining we need. So I'm thinking that language goes way back further than that to get up to that point. And that from then on, humans have institutions, because institutions are built on language. And the specific institution that I spoke about is the one that involves male-male alliances and males controlling patriarchy, in addition to all of the stuff about sexual division of labor and size differences and that sort of thing. That's one point. Let's see, if we're going to have a discussion, do I list my several points? And maybe I'll list my several points and then come back. Okay, so Ian, you also said that you think that human ability for cumulative culture is the only hardwired ability that is responsible for human evolution, or something like that. Maybe you were thinking that it's the only one that distinguishes us from what? From chimpanzees, or from Homo, the Pleistocene Homo that preceded sapiens? At any rate, you seem to really downplay the notion that there have been any significant genetic changes in humans recently. It wasn't quite clear what you were saying, but maybe I should ask you. Well, let me ask you.
Sure, yeah, maybe I was speaking sloppily, I usually am. But it seems to me, I think a lot of the things where people say, oh, is a certain kind of behavior. I mean, I say aggression. Is this something that's hardwired into humans? I think that much more important is our ability to evaluate costs and benefits of situations and respond to them and build up over time new institutions and new sets of values. And I think that sort of biologically evolved ability to evolve our culture is what makes us so profoundly different from all the animals, rather than seeking a specifically biological basis for all the different bits of behavior. Better or worse?
Yeah, I'm still not quite sure what the comparison is with. Humans to pre-sapiens humans, or
Yeah, I mean, I think 20 years ago, most archaeologists would have said, basically what Richard was saying, that this is a uniquely Homo sapiens thing. Neanderthals probably don't have this, Homo erectus probably doesn't have this. Now, I think more and more archaeologists are saying, you know, Neanderthals, Denisovans, all the other kinds of Homo that now seem to be popping up everywhere, they are all moving in the same sort of direction by 300,000 years ago, to having the ability to accumulate culture over time and to create innovate in ways that build on what's been done before. The reason that you don't see the cultural explosion that Richard was describing 50,000 years ago, which is very real. I mean, he's right. There are some archaeologists who say that didn't happen. That is just delusional. And you're quite right. The difference between Upper Paleolithic European art and what's been done before is just night and day. But I think what they are increasingly saying is that the cognitive capacities to create that kind of cultural revolution have been there a very long time before 50,000 years ago. And we do keep seeing these little flashes of innovation and change and distinctly modern looking behavior all around the world. Then they go out again, they disappear again. And so the most popular theory now is that it's all driven by population size. And there's been a lot of work done on what is the minimum effective learning community you can have to keep complicated concepts working and allowing for mistakes in transmission and also for extinctions, which again, like Richard was saying, these are populations constantly teetering on the brink of extinction. And I don't know whether these numbers are still going. Richard would certainly know. I mean, I read something recently, a genetic study suggesting that around 100,000 years ago, there's probably only like 15,000 Homo sapiens in Africa. I don't know if that people still say that, but these tiny, shockingly small numbers. And so the most popular theory now is that for tens of thousands of years, cumulative cultural evolution keeps fizzling out. And what changes is this population explosion starting somewhere around 100,000 years ago. Although why that happened and why it's sapiens in particular that benefit from this, that does not seem to be explained. I haven't seen anyone, Steve Shannon or any of these guys come up with an explanation for that. But yeah, I mean, this is not my field of expertise, but this is definitely where the field has gone in the last 20 years.
Well, okay, so what I was trying to ask was, in order to sort of pinpoint the point at which you think that genetic adaptation is irrelevant. You know, you made this claim that cultural ability is the only hardwired ability that does something.
There is no point at which genetic adaptation becomes irrelevant. This is a continuous.
Okay, good. Because, you know, I want to push back a little bit on this. You know, I don't want to be mistaken as claiming that culture is not important. I think that all the things you said about culture are absolutely right. You know, and certainly, you know, the arguments that have been advanced about the relationship between increased population size and cultural retentions and cultural inventions and transmissions, you know, that all sounds, you know, looks solid. But I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater. If you now look at children in various different countries in the world and look at individual variation in both proactive and propensity for proactive and reactive aggression, you find a very strong genetic association using, you know, the classic twin studies. I think there's lots of evidence that the propensity for aggressiveness in humans is associated with our genes. This does not mean, please, that I am ignoring culture. It just means that there is one feature here that we can look at. And the notion that we, as this incredibly calm, tolerant species, you know, all here just listening very politely to each other, have not changed in terms of our aggressiveness from an earlier ancestor, it seems to me extraordinarily difficult to sustain, given the evidence that there is a very strong association, experimentally shown, between selection against reactive aggression and changes in phenotype. And that we see those phenotypic changes in human evolution. So here we are, you know, enormously low in aggressive propensities compared to any other primate you can look at. And as I say, you know, we've got the evidence that indicates that this changed. That this would have changed from selection against reactive aggression, which is what you expect when you get execution. So, you know, I understand I'm rehearsing this, but I just want to emphasize that it seems to me that one can take a very reasonable genetic argument and have it alongside a cultural argument. I don't think we should say only one is important.
No, again, anybody with any sense would have to agree with that. And the argument, of course, is what is the right balance? And this is where everybody disagrees profoundly with each other. When I was in high school, there was this family, the Cluttons. The Cluttons, everyone in my high school believed in the importance of genetics in a disposition to violence. You just had to meet one of the Cluttons to learn how very much it was hardwired into them. Yeah, and I think that the challenge is to understand the balance between these two, and obviously that drives the whole field of cultural evolution in a way. This is what it's about. And I think, and when you give a lecture, I've had this experience myself several times. You write a book, and it's all full of your subtleties and your brilliant deep thought. Then you give a 50-minute lecture, and you don't have much time in 50 minutes to share your subtlety and deep thought. And I thought in the lecture version of what you, the work you've been doing, the lecture version, the culture side really did drop off the map a bit. And so I guess I would like to see it brought back more back into the story, even if we do still in fact disagree very much perhaps on what the balance is between the two. I would have liked to have heard you talking more about that balance.
Well, fair enough. And yeah, you know, it's difficult to know what to leave out. As
yeah, you can't please it.
But I would also point out that my second lecture was really all about culture. You know, so I was trying to sort of build the biological evidence for, I think, a unique behavioral system in Homo sapiens, and then see how it applied. You know. So that's my defense. So I just want to think about this, the cognition aspect. It's just, I think, a matter of interest that in the studies that have been done so far of domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors, there is no systematic change in cognitive ability. And the reason I think that this is, well, I should just enlarge on that and saying there are some changes. You get in the comparison between wolves and dogs, the indication is that there are differences in the way that they solve problems, but not so much that the dogs are either better or worse than wolves at solving problems overall. And similar things with guinea pigs in relationship to cavies. You know, there have been a few studies which are going in this direction. And the reason I draw attention to it is when thinking about Neanderthals against sapiens, because you know, one of these fascinating consequences of domestication is a reduction in the size of the brain. And the reduction in the size of the brain is often taken by people to mean reduction in intelligence. There's absolutely no evidence of that. Some people, I mean, Brian Hare in particular, is really trying to explore the cognitive consequences of domestication and thinking that it could well be associated with an increase in ability to communicate and ability to communicate particularly in ways that are relevant to culture. That's still, you know, early ground, I would say. But the point I want to get to in this is that it seems to me reasonable to think that the sort of sheer problem-solving ability of Neanderthals and sapiens, which I take to be a relatively undomesticated versus a relatively domesticated version, based on their cranial anatomy, their sheer cognitive ability in terms of problem solving may have been very similar. What I would expect to be different would be, thanks to genes, their tolerance, their inter-individual tolerance. And that seems to me to be something that we may not be able to test right now by the archaeological record, but we should be able to test in the ways that I suggested and already are testing through genes. If we find consistently, as has already been found so far in early days of the genetic analysis, that the genes of Neanderthals and sapiens differ in the same way that genes between wild and domesticated animals do, and that those genes are associated with reduced reactive aggression, then that seems to me, to be, I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's all a priori. No one looked at the genes and said, here, and then we construct a story from it. We're saying this is a prediction. And so far, there have been like 4 studies that come out and say, yeah, this is all going in the right direction. So I'll just mention what
that gives you your testability, falsifiability thing Richard was saying.
Well, exactly, that's right. Well, but it's not directly the archaeology, but it's the genes associated with the fossils. And then more on the archaeology. So my prediction, which I think is too early to be able to answer from the samples available at the moment, is that you will find more evidence of the kinds of injuries, traumatic injuries that occur from reactive aggression in Neanderthals than you do in sapiens, and in all the other species that are not domesticated compared to sapiens. I just want to point out that this week there was a paper published looking at the injuries sustained in a sample from Atapuerca, from Cima de la Huesos. And I can't remember the exact date. What would that be? 500,000, 600,000?
430. 430.
430.
430.
Oh, 430. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah. And they had a very high rate of injury.
Well,
sorry?
there's one skull. And I mean, if you look at the fossil record, the difference in how you detect injury. Of course, there's always a problem knowing what caused it, but the difference between Neanderthals and modern Indians, there's none, absolutely none in the fossil record. And the fact that you can find the skull of Cima de los Huesos in Spain before 400,000 years ago, that looks like it got hit on the head. Okay. I mean, a lot of modern Indian skulls like that, dents and all kinds. Can I say a couple of...
Well, I didn't finish my point.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I just wanted to make this point that you may challenge the interpretation of the article, but what the article said was, here we have evidence of a very high rate of injury, and they said, so this means there was a lot of war or a lot of intergroup aggression. And my point is, they did not consider the possibility that the rate of within group aggression was very high. And I think that the reason they didn't is because all of us have the assumption that what we are like now goes back in time, and that members of the genus Homo would not be so brutal as to constantly bonk each other on the head. So that was the implication that I read into that article, that they never even considered the possibility that what they reported as a very high rate of injury could have been due to within group aggression. So.
Well, I can maybe say something about that. This language thing, I think, is very important. And we can actually investigate the history of language, or the evolution of language, in the fossil record. I've cut down many trees writing about that. But if you look back before, say, 2.5 million years ago, you have these people called Australopiths, man apes of Africa, bipedal apes. They had ape-like vocal tracts and ape-like ears. And then suddenly, again, it's a kind of sudden thing. I'm a big believer in punctuated equilibrium, right? The long periods of stasis, short periods of evolutionary change. Suddenly, about 2 to 2.5 million years ago, you get vocal tracts and ears that look much more like ours. That's got to be selection for language, I think, beginning 2 million years ago. It doesn't tell us anything about their cognition, and it may not even tell us anything about how sophisticated they were in terms of speaking. Now, when you move on, let me give you anecdotally. I started my career, of all places, working in Ukraine. I was a graduate student in Chicago, and I went to Russia and Ukraine to look at the artifacts that Neanderthals have made. And I wrote a dissertation about that. Then later on, because it wasn't possible to work in these places, I wanted to do field work. I went to South Africa. And the first site I actually did there, I found these artifacts dated to what we thought was the time range of the Neanderthals, let's say 100,000, 40,000 years ago. They look just like the ones I'd seen in Ukraine and Russia, made by the Neanderthals. Amazing. If somebody had said to me, there must have been Neanderthals in South Africa based on those artifacts, I'd say, okay, except we know they weren't. We did get some human remains and they were more like us than they were like Neanderthals. My point being that before 50,000 years ago, wherever you go in the world, people are all behaving in more or less the same way. And take the artifacts, very difficult to distinguish different kinds. You know, what I was supposed to be doing for my dissertation. I didn't do a very good job of it because I don't think Neanderthals did that. I don't think they cared a whole lot about whether this was a tool for a specific purpose. We got to make it this way, and we got to make this tool over here differently because it's for a different purpose. That appears at 50,000 years ago. You look at artifacts after 50,000 years ago, it's as if the people went to the hardware store. We need, we need a screwdriver, we need a saw, we need a hammer. That doesn't appear until 50,000 years ago. Now, if that isn't related to cognition, what is it related to? Something happened 50,000 years ago, or a little before. It happened in Africa. I admit that I can't prove it was genetic, but I think it was. I can't imagine anything else. Natural selection, if you had people who suddenly were able to do things that they couldn't do before, that enhanced their ability to extract nature and build it into people, they're going to be highly favored by natural selection. I think that's what happened. And I think it is genetically based. Now, that's at least something that is potentially testable. And I tried to convince people at the, well, they actually, I don't need convincing, they just need the material, at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, where they do a lot of this ancient DNA work, to look for that. Svante Pabo, who's the principal person there, is pretty sympathetic to it. They just can't get the material to do that. It's not easy to get material, bone DNA out of bones that reveals these functional genes. But I predict when it is possible, I wouldn't have thought 30 years ago we'd have any DNA from Neanderthal genes, from Neanderthals. We do. And maybe 30 years from now, we'll know a lot more about Neanderthal behavior from their genes when we can get more. The ability to get this DNA out is advanced dramatically. But to me, that's what's really, and this is a testable idea. Something happened 50,000 years ago, and then these people in Africa, they're in Europe, and the Neanderthals are gone. And you can I can go into that in great detail. I've written, again, a lot about that. What, and sure, I mean, there's always evidence, there's a shell from a 500,000-year-old site in Java. Got some scratch marks on it. It's a marine shell, a mollusk. And it was published in Nature as the oldest art in the world. Take a look at it sometime. I'll give you the name of the site. I'll give you the reference. You think that's art? Well, people who published it thought so. The referees at Nature must have thought so. It's, it's, again, this pornography problem. Does it look like pornography? Does it or not? I don't think it looks like art. Art is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And if you're an enthusiast for art before 50,000 years ago, you can find it. There's just piles of stuff out there to look at, to find it. So this to me is the most significant feature of human evolution. Well, there may be two. There's this 2 or 2.5 million year change from the bipedal apes to people in the narrow sense, and then 50,000 years ago to people like us. If you can fit in stuff about societal patriarchy into that, fine. But
well, not just societal patriarchy, but the reduction in aggressiveness. I mean,
whatever.
It's got to be huge.
Whatever, but it's going to be very difficult to get at this question of aggression. I mean, we have bones of the Neanderthals. They often do heel fractures, concussions that you can see in the bone. But you see that in the modern humans too. Well, something else I might mention there. Talk about brain size. If a reduction in brain size is an indicator of self-domestication, the earliest fully modern humans in Europe, the Cro-Magnons we call them, who lived there between 50,000 and 10,000 years, enormous brains, much larger than ours. There's been a reduction in brain size since the Middle Ages. Why is that? It's not because we're more domesticated, I think. I don't think anybody really knows about that. You know who the people are who have the largest brains among living humans? It's the Inuit. I'll give you some figures. The average in this room would probably be about 1,350 cubic centimeters on the inside. The Neanderthals were bigger than that, maybe 1,450. The Cro-Magnons were 1,550, and the Inuit are like the Cro-Magnons. Now, one of the things that's important there, where do the Inuit live? They live in an environment that's very cold, and having a bigger brain is advantageous in a cold environment. It maintains its heat, which is important to brain function. The Cro-Magnons had the same issue. People afterwards didn't. And what happens? Culture buffers, of course, a lot of this need to have bodily adaptations to cold. But brain size is something that has declined, dramatically after the advent of modern humans. Then there's also this problem. I brought this up with Richard in email a while ago. What do we do about the Australian Aborigines, who cranial morphology, in fact, could suggest they were less domesticated than the Neanderthals? Now, they really have rugged skulls. Well, I was put in charge of the cranial collection we had at Stanford, now largely gone, returned to the tribes that were supposed to have it. I was supposed to go through this and catalog it, and then we were supposed to decide what to do with these skulls. There was a skull that had no information on where it came from, but it was very obviously Australian Aboriginal. You know, they're very distinctive. And there's nobody would argue today that they're not capable of being airline pilots or computer scientists or whatever. So whatever that morphology is, it isn't related to cognition. You know, their skulls are variable in size. I don't think there's any indication that they're smaller than anybody else's. But they're a problem because they do look like they're not, in Richard's terms, it do look like they're not domesticated.
Well,
Let me just insert myself here to say, let's take a few more minutes to finish this portion of the discussion, and then we'll open it a bit more.
Okay, I'm sorry. I've gone
No,
too long.
not at all. Richard, do you want to make a response, and then we'll open up?
well, the Australian Aborigine case is kind of fascinating. But when you say that they're really rugged, that seems an important dimension to be thinking about. But when I think about the difference between the crania of Neanderthals and sapiens, I think about the analyses that indicate pedomorphism in the sapiens development compared to Neanderthals. So the 16 stages of growth that some people have, maybe you have assigned to the ontogeny of the skulls, and sapiens goes to the 15th and Neanderthals goes further. I assume that does not apply to the Australians.
That they start out, that they don't get, they
I
remain more childlike as they
Well, they're
we
not,
do and they don't. Is that?
I'm assuming that they do not go through to the Neanderthal developmental stage that is added on to the rest of sapiens.
I don't know. We have juvenile Neanderthals, and a colleague of mine, Jean-Jacques Leblanc, has worried a lot about how they, you know, whether their life history, their rate of development, and so forth, is similar to ours, different. You know, different in a way that doesn't necessarily imply that they were more. One thing I think is important here. I mean, I don't know what to say about the Australian Aborigines. They don't fit the self-domestication model very well, and whether that has to do with the way they have matured, scuttily or not, I don't know. But I think that we have to consider that the possibility that what we're looking at in modern humans is highly variable in terms of morphology, and we tend to focus on ourselves, meaning Europeans and Africans, and we don't worry very much about people, or I guess East Asians as well, but we don't worry very much about people in Australia, New Guinea, whatever. If we did, I think we would have a very different idea if we emphasize that about later human evolution. I don't know that it's relevant to, you know, societal patriarchy. They certainly have it in Australia in a big way, don't they? Big way, Aboriginal. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of descriptions. Richard gave us this case with two women snuck up on a male ceremony. It's, you know, it's really taboo. And so they were killed. It's not like honor killing, right? Basically that sort of thing. And boy, societal patriarchy was a really big thing there, in spite of the fact that you could say they look more like Neanderthals than they do like other modern humans. I don't think that's a fair way of characterizing their appearance, but they certainly had very, very rugged skulls.
Yeah, but I just want to emphasize that, as I understand it, there's no evidence that they differ from the rest of sapiens in this, that they are pedomorphic in relationship to Neanderthals.
Pedomorphic in relationship to Neanderthals?
Yes.
No, I mean, pedomorphy, you understand the idea. If you're, you know, infants are very much, you know, they look very different than adults. You can imagine a situation in which infant morphology is maintained into adulthood. We call that pedomorphy. You know, where adults tend to look more like children in some situations than others. I don't think there's any evidence. Neanderthals were, you know, pedomorphic as we are in terms of what we know about their development. There's no indication that they were different.
No, it's the other way around. That we are pedomorphic in relationship to Neanderthals.
No, well, yes. I mean, you can say that. That's using us as the standard. I don't know why that, you know, let's use the Australian Aborigines as a standard.
Well, no, it's using Neanderthals as a standard.
Well, they're different. There's no question that they're different in lots of ways. I can go into that in great detail, but I think it's just a difference. And I think, you know, in a way, it's fortunate. You can imagine going out and taking a hike in the Alps in a place that's never been visited in recent times, and you run across a group of Neanderthals. You know, if you were an ethnographer and you were trying to describe them the way you would describe the ethnography of the Australian Aborigines, it wouldn't work very well. I think you'd find some differences that would be very difficult to deal with. And we then have the question, if they were still alive, are we going to admit them to Stanford and Harvard, or are we going to put them in a zoo? They were different, there's no question. But I don't think they were different in the way you think they were. I don't think that they're examples of wild humans. I think they would still look very much like humans.
Well,
It was different in detail. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to draw this portion to a close, although I do want to just end the this portion of the discussion by asking for, I'm sorry, there's the feedback, asking for what I thought we just got as a clear answer to the question, Richard, about the falsifiability of the account you have. And if I've got you right, since this came up at several moments over the course of the past couple of days, the falsifiability that you believe would attach to your account would be found if we had sufficient access to the archaeological record of Neanderthals to look for significantly greater levels of violence.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. I want to open it now to questions from the group. I've got a few questions here as well on the web. I'm going to give initial deference to our distinguished guests who have arrived. So Professor Lloyd, let's begin with you.
Yeah, I wanted to address the falsifiability and the issue that you don't have falsification possibilities here, Richard. I think you just gave too much away. The claim that you're missing falsification, you have predicted a series of features of self-domestication, which you then went out and not only looked for, but discovered an array of skeletal, hormonal, developmental, and genetic and anatomical features of the species in question, which I would, as a philosopher of science, call insurance demonstrating the non-falsification of your theory. It is falsifiable theory, and you have already demonstrated that it's so far not at all falsified by the evidence. I mean, that's not a guarantee for the future. Of course, that's not how falsifiability works, but you've got a heap of evidence already accumulated. It's demonstrated in your book. But just to ask, just to make a further point about societal patriarchy that was made by Dr. Klein, the sexual division of labor coming from arising out of responsibilities of women for birthing and nursing and taking care of infants and doing that over and over again, as you say. This theory was actually promoted and articulated by a feminist author, Shulamith Firestone, in a very influential book in 1970 called The Dialectic of Sex. And it was very influential on the early second wave feminists. So you're in very good company with this theory, I wanted to say. I do have one more question that's for Richard. Should I ask?
Please go ahead, and then we'll open it up.
Okay, that's my last question. It's about the theory of the organized men killing the bully, and the fact that it's all the way to murder, and the fact that this murder is going to have a strong enough genetic selection pressure to produce genetic changes in the entire population's tendency to both reactive and proactive aggression. I wanted to look a little closer at it and make some what I think of as plausible assumptions or guesses about life history and ask if this is going to work. So the adult bullying males, the wannabe alpha males in question, I take it that they may start reproducing in their early 20s at the latest, typically, and they may not get executed even under the extreme punishment version of the story until they're at their peak of their power, which may be in their early 30s, after they've already produced a number of children who are likely to be well provisioned because they were bullies. And they were, what really is the genetic cost of being a bad guy under those assumptions? The wife or wives can remarry after the bully's execution, since it may likely be understood that she was bullied just like everybody else was bullied. So as a mother, she's not going to get punished. So again, where's the genetic cost of, I'm just trying to work out what the life history would look like of the murdering band of bros model. Is it large enough, in other words, to cause a change in the entire dominance hierarchy of the species over evolutionary time? And I do know that small changes can accumulate and make a big change. My fear is that we're confusing social cost with genetic cost, and that this is a great social story about evolutionary change, but maybe primarily a social story combined with a genetic story. I'm confused, and I just wondered what your reflections were on that.
Yeah, well, I agree that that's an important issue. We need models, probably, because they can test the assumptions. And I don't have anything sort of nicely crystalline in this respect. I don't understand why you would say that they start breeding at one age and then it takes a long time, 10 years or something, for them to be executed. I would imagine that something happens more like what Boehm described in the few cases in the ethnographies that he discovered of men who behaved in the way that pre-sapiens putatively behaved. Namely, these few individuals who acted like tyrants, who acted like the boys in Ian's school. And it did not take 10 years. It may take a few weeks, it may even take a little longer than that. But men resent being dominated and bullied in that way, and they do something about it.
Okay.
That's one point. The other point is that having babies is not enough, of course, because the babies have got to survive for fitness to be maximized. And you certainly find cases nowadays in the execution literature, if you want to call it that, of entire families being killed. Maybe less extreme than that is that when children are left fatherless, then they are more likely to die. And that's been shown in a number of populations contemporaneously. So in the Aceh, where there are father deaths, then the survival of the offspring is about half the rate of survival of the offspring where there isn't a father death. So those sorts of complexities may add to the fitness cost to a male of being a bully.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was just operating with a kind of lack of life history information. And I think that really needs to be modeled and spelled out in order. I mean, you acknowledge that we need to have that phenotypic information in order to make the case go. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. But I mean, I would add the problem that, in some ways it's incredibly helpful to read the present into the past, and the specifics of male alliances controlling bullies is what I would like to read into the past, but we shouldn't read too much into the past, because the further back we go into the past, and the more the dynamics are bound to have changed. And in particular, the bullies were worse.
All right, I'd like to get Joan into the conversation, and then Josh, and then we'll go to a webinar participant.
Fantastic. Okay. I'm excited for the webinar participant because my friend Ben Gleason is in the audience and has a question for you, following up on my question from yesterday. So I have two questions, one on feminist political theory, which I'm going to hold off on, and one on democratic theory. So let's see how this goes. So I want to comment on this idea that contemporary humans have reduced reactive aggression, because I think I'm a little confused on the definitions of aggression here. It seems like what we're pointing to when we're talking about reduced reactive aggression is reduced reactive violence. But I'm wondering if that's really true in contemporary humans. So if the circumstances are right, we do see tons of reactive violence. And so I'm thinking of Thucydides' famous example of the plague, right? So we do, or, Lord of the Flies, right? There are like lots of places where we might see this kind of equally reactive violence. So it might be that contemporary humans are just as reactively aggressive as maybe our ancestors pre 300,000 years ago, but it's channeled differently. So we're bringing back in Professor Morris's kind of idea. And the way that this connects to democratic theory is that there's this theory of agonism, which says that conflict basically is constant in the human condition. But the advantage of democracy is that conflict is channeled in such a way that we're no longer killing each other. So it's the creation of social channels to change how that violence manifests, more so than the decrease of violence overall. And I just wanted to ask you, I mean, again, this comes back to kind of evidence, like if we're relying on primates as our example of changed reactive violence, whether or not we might actually be missing something.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, thank you for it. And what you're doing is enriching the arena in which we're thinking about aggression. You know, again, I'd like to emphasize the fact that because I'm taking an angle of thinking about genetic evolution, that does not mean that I don't think that cultural evolution hasn't been hugely important as well. And when you say, hey, you know, isn't democracy great at reducing the frequency of expressed reactive violence, something like that, you may be right. You know, I would actually think that democracy is much more important in reducing proactive violence, but you know, we can talk about that. But either way, I'm sure you're right. I'm very persuaded by the kind of arguments produced by Josh Goldstein and Steve Pinker and others about the reduced frequency of death by violence over the recordable history. That is probably totally trivially due to anything genetic, probably nothing at all. It's due to institutional arrangements. So, you know, I'm totally with you there. But the fact that that's true doesn't mean that we can't include a genetic component, which happens over a longer period and for which we go back to the evidence that I've been citing. Does that speak to what you're saying or not?
I think it just diminishes the explanatory power of your account, because now we do have a kind of problem in figuring out what sets of evidence give us what causal phenomena. Does that make sense? So if we have the two accounts competing to explain the same phenomenon, then I guess I'm right. And I don't
think it is the same phenomenon. I think there are two phenomena. You know, one, you have a time scale here, and we're starting out at 2 million years ago here. Well, no, let's start at 300,000 years ago. And reactive aggression is declining there. And then if you wanted to talk about reactive aggression in the last millennia, you know, it's plunging here, and they're two different phenomena.
Well, I will email you, but yes, I have more thoughts on that.
Josh.
I have several things, and I'll just throw out a few and answer whatever you want. I mean, one is sort of the obvious question about to the extent to which alpha behavior is noticeable within history. I mean, after all, we have lots of cases in which you have supreme leader. Some of these supreme leaders get a lot of genetic advantage out of being supreme leader, the family of Genghis Khan being, you know, the sort of the famous one. So to what extent have we gotten rid of alphas, and to what extent within the scaling up that is possible with agriculture and so on, does alpha behavior simply reappear? And if it does, how does it work? Are the alphas simply basically doing an end run around the betas, gathering all the gammas behind them? So anyway, it's that should we be worried about the fact that there seems to be a lot of alpha behavior still in the world? It seems to give a lot of advantage to those alphas and to make the sort of nice story about betas controlling a little bit less powerful. The second thing was just, and this is just, I have no idea what the answer to this, but how do we really test the reduction of reactive aggression with domestication? I mean, are there studies of packs of wild dogs and the behavior of packs of wild dogs towards each other as read the packs of wolves towards each other. And do we find that packs of wild dogs have less violence towards one another than ditto wild pigs versus the, I mean, to what extent is the genetics actually changing the behavior, or to what extent just simply the circumstances of their living in a domesticated environment? I mean, I just don't know, but I think at least it's plausible to think that wild dogs, which people are scared shitless of wild dogs who live around them. Once again, not African wild dogs, right? I mean, we're talking about domestic dogs that have gone wild, right? So I just don't know the answer to that, but that would be at least one way to sort of test the idea about whether it's reactive aggression that is is being reduced with domestication, or whether it's something else. The third thing is just and once again, it's just sort of a puzzle, and this is about the patriarchy, is that why would the betas in every known society feel that it is to their advantage to dominate women? I mean, why isn't there some society in which the betas say, well, actually making a coalition with the women is a better way? I mean, I can see that some societies just might, but I don't understand why that should be a universal. Those are the three questions. And once again, they're just puzzles.
Are cats domesticated? Are cats domesticated?
Well, yeah, I have a cat, and I wonder about that quite a lot. The basic answer seems to be kind of, but they go feral extremely quickly, and they act exactly like wild cats as soon as they do. So there doesn't seem to be any change in cat behavior.
There's a huge change in cat behavior.
No, but I mean, a domestic cat in the wild acts quite a lot like Libica acts in the wild.
Yeah, no, they can do really well in the wild. Yeah. That's absolutely. But if you try and take a wild cat and put it in your home, you would notice the difference.
Yeah.
I mean,
but genetically, that cat that is wild, I mean, I'm saying, take a cat that has lived wild all its life and try to bring it into your home, and you'll have difficulty.
You mean a domesticated feral cat?
Yeah.
Not a wild.
Yeah. That's right. Yes. I mean, you can be. I mean, you can get them to, but some. I mean, I've had friends who've tried to do it, and it's never succeeded. So anyway, I mean, leave cats aside. How about packs of wild dogs? I mean, has anyone ever studied or wild pigs? And I mean, it seems that it is sort of a way to test the hypothesis. I mean, either they are less violent towards each other or they're not.
Yes, right. I'm trying to think about what tests have been done in that respect.
Well, feral dogs do form packs, and probably you could go out and see whether they, in fact, are more violent to each other than when they're fully domesticated living.
Yes, no, and they are. They're much less violent. So the frequency of lethal aggression in wolves is very high. It's one of the highest you find in any animal. There are samples in which 50% of adult wolves die from being killed by other wolves. In studies of feral dogs, intergroup interactions, they will chase each other, but I'm not sure if there are any records of them being killed. So there's a massive difference there. I was trying to think about dingoes, because dingoes are one of these fascinating cases of a species that was domesticated and then has lived wild for a long time. But I can't remember if there are any studies of that speak to this point directly in dingoes. But yeah, no, I mean, these are great ways to get at the questions you're asking. So you said about alpha males in history, or
yes, I mean,
what I would call not alpha males.
Pick your historical alpha.
Leader males, the famous Genghis Khan example, and so on. I would just like to use that observation that there is alpha male-like behavior and alpha male-like success in humans to point out that this process, this putative process, is not supposed to have ended. And there have been sort of kind of constant reversals, as individual males are able to use whatever bullying they can to have high reproductive success. I think it's difficult to imagine just how brutal we would have been 12,000 generations, something like that, earlier, when we get the first tiny intimations of selection against reactive aggression, to judge from the grassalization of the crania at that stage. Grassalization, I shouldn't really say in front of you. I'm just designating as a shorthand for the suite of changes that are associated with domestication in experimentally domesticated animals. So yes, you get humans, males trying to achieve high reproductive success through bullying and so on, and maybe we should see that as temporarily reversing the overall direction of evolution. It's not quite the same way that the males would have behaved when they were more gorilla-like, but nevertheless, it emphasizes that we are not part of a process that has just smoothly gone from more aggressive to less aggressive. There was one other.
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, so you said, why don't the beta males sometimes make peace with the females? And that gives me an opportunity to say, look, there's tremendous amount of variation, cultural variation in relationships between men and women. And maybe you could say that there are some places in which the beta males have made peace with the women. To the point of letting the women have equal or dominant say in social societal decisions. Nobody seems to have found that society yet. But since we're talking about institutions, albeit affected by male reproductive strategies, the fact that there is this big institutional cultural component makes it perfectly reasonable that there should be some variation. It's just very striking that it hasn't happened fully yet, but I'm sure it's happened to some extent. I mean, it's clear it's happened to some extent.
All right, so I'm in my own head categorizing some of the terrain here. We've got a series of questions about what might falsify your account. We have a series of questions that I think Ian summarized by saying we're trying to figure out how we might referee the balance between a genetic explanation and a cultural or institutional explanation. And then there's a question here from the webinar, Ben Gleason, whom Joan referred to, of offering up an alternative account on the genetic evolution story. So Ben's question is the following. It seems logically problematic to suggest that cooperation amongst beta males led to human cooperation. I wonder, how did these beta males become cooperative in the first place? Isn't it likely that pre-sapiens females were already relatively less aggressive and more cooperative, say due to benefits of cooperative breeding? And following from this, couldn't female coalitions have played a role in selecting against aggressive males throughout earlier hominin evolution, as noted in our bonobo relatives? How else could cooperative beta males first emerge?
Well, how else could cooperative beta males first emerge? In exactly the same way as we see in chimpanzees. That is to say, you see a lot of cooperation in chimpanzees in the context of intergroup aggression. They are very good, they're horrendously good at killing members of neighboring groups. They do that entirely through the use of coalitionary proactive aggression. So they're very good at cooperating to kill. And when I say they're very good, what I mean is that in the scores of cases that have been recorded, when a very strong male chimpanzee has been fighting for his life and failed, there is not a single case of the aggressors being seriously wounded. So they're very good at judging the circumstances in which to make an attack such that they are safe. And basically, it is choosing a major imbalance of power and the average number of aggressors to the victim at the time that the attack takes place is 8 to 1. So you have 8 chimpanzees trying to attack one victim, and the one can be immobilized because one chimp can hold a foot, another can hold another foot, another can hold an arm, and so on. And now you have a totally immobilized victim, and then limbs can be twisted until they break. The thorax can be bitten out, testicles can be torn off, and so on. So are chimps good at cooperating? Absolutely. Why shouldn't Homo be just as good at cooperating? They clearly had some hunting going on, and it's very likely that the hunting would involve some cooperation, but it seems to me to be utterly likely that they would have had occasional interactions with their neighbors in which they supported each other. So that was the answer to the end of the
last
question.
bit. What about female cooperationists selecting against male aggression?
Well, it's a nice idea. It's sort of politically attractive. It shows no evidence in contemporary ethnography. So I think it counts against it. The bonobo parallel is interesting, but then I think it's merely a potential parallel because bonobos have gone off on their own evolutionary path in a way that is uninformative about the phylogeny of human behavior. They separated from a chimpanzee-like ancestor somewhere maybe around 1 million years ago. So it would be curious to me if you had a period in human evolution when females were somehow able to use alliances with each other to dominate males and to push humans towards a social arrangement in which female choice was more important, female political power was more important, and then it disappeared. So that's my problem with it, but we're coming back.
Well, so I don't know that we need to go as far with female sexual agency as to think that's been institutionalized in some sense, even in like pre-hominids. What you might simply think is that it's a secondary factor, even in addition to yours. And evidence that might be useful in this case are, and admittedly, I don't know this evidence super well, but human physiology. So there is some kind of question about penis size relative to testes size in humans. So have you read any of this research? I think it's quite.
You threw me. That was a jump for me.
Okay, all right. Okay, so there's like so basically some arguments say like in some species when the testes are quite big, it's a sign that there's going to be multi-male, multi-female breeding, right? And you're a zoologist, you know all this. And so one of the things that we see that's kind of interesting about humans relative to other primates is the relative size of the testes and the relative size of the penis. And there is some argument that, and I don't know how accurate this has remained because it's from 2010, that the shape of the male penis is actually such that it creates like a vacuuming effect that can pull out competitive sperm. So what you might see is a female having sex with an alpha male and then later choosing a beta male and like having the language to like have these kind of secret meetings on the side, in which case, like if you have repeated sex with a beta male and you don't have a period of heat, then the female does have some space for choosing the likelihood of which kind of sperm she's likely to hold on to. And then we can bring in kind of questions of the female orgasm, the active uterus. I guess I would just push you on this idea that like, I understand the fear of reading contemporary politics back into the past. It is very dangerous to finding the truth. But I don't know that that isn't like, I think there are evidence from other areas of life that might help us see this as a more viable possibility.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I cherish the approach. But what I'm impressed by is that although female choice is clearly a potent force in many species, in the group living old world monkeys and apes, in which we have data where there are alpha males, females have relatively limited ability to exert their choice. And increasingly what we're finding is that coercion by males is a very serious constraint on female ability. So if we can marry the interest in female choice and sexual agency to a world in which we have this problem of alpha males being willing to use extreme force to get what they want, then let's explore that. And I would just add in this context that, or just emphasize that, I as it were, apologized for focusing on males in this, and Ian has criticized me for not talking enough about culture, and I can sort of feel the criticism that I didn't talk enough about females. You can't do everything, but with regard to females, there will probably be ways in which we can do much more to think about what these kinds of changes would have meant to females, what the role of females would have been in affecting the outcomes, just in all sorts of ways, getting them engaged. It's just that that hasn't happened so far. I'm looking forward to it happening. There's no reason why it shouldn't.
Won't be me, but I'm a theorist, but yeah.
Okay.
All right, I believe we have two final questions. Did you want to get in as well? Okay, we'll end with these two questions. Can I take them in tandem, and then we'll finish with a final comment here. Why don't we begin with you, please?
So I, in listening to you over the past few days, was really intrigued by the way that so much of this seems to dovetail with aspects of Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado's social dominance theory, which observes three major hierarchies in human social organization, among which, we'll just go through them since there's a few, are age, patriarchy, and outgroup dominance. And he connects the presence of patriarchy to, like Richard Klein was describing, sexual dimorphism between the human sexes. And I was kind of surprised not to see some reference to just how well that literature corroborates this literature as supportive. And I don't know if you perceive it as supportive, if you perceive it just as like slight difference in sort of causation for this pattern, if you perceive it as less than supportive. And of course, this sexual dimorphic difference is something that arises well before, the 50,000 year ago point in human development, anthropological and social development that Richard Klein has lately spoken of. So is this something that, there is present, the physical dimorphism, but it's language, cultural accumulation, social complication that allows this difference to manifest itself? And if so, then I'm kind of also wondering, which is somewhat distantly, actually quite distantly related, in the discussion of sort of human biodiversity, I was thinking of, I forget the euphemistic term, but pygmy populations who are obviously physically distinct. What's their sexual dimorphism like? How does patriarchy present or not present among their populations? That's quite distant, so maybe we can table that, but.
Is it okay if we take the second question?
Okay,
please.
Oh boy, it's real different. It'll be an interesting package. If you're going to talk about important periods in human history and thinking about big transitions, and I'm pulling out the logic of cooking here, Richard. If cooking is going to have these big influences, then we should look for big transitions in the human fossil record, right? If we're going to see big transitions in the human fossil record and human evolution generally, we should think about where the big changes happen, right? And because of the nature of the human life cycle, we can write down a model for this, and we can calculate where the predominance of selection is, right? And that predominance of selection lies overwhelmingly in what we would call in the biz juvenile recruitment, right? It's about infant survivorship, it's about childhood survivorship. And so wherever some major, and this has to do with the fact of our late age at first reproduction, our highly heteroparous life history, meaning that we have multiple reproductive bouts spread out over a long period of time. It's just a function of the way our life histories are arranged, that the overwhelming preponderance of selection happens early in the life cycle, and it's weighted towards infant survival and child survival. Whatever big thing happens has to affect that. It has to, because everything else is sort of small in comparison to that, right? And in fact, you can then show that in more sophisticated quantitative genetic models that the covariances with infant survival, right? You can't they constrain the capacity to, increase fertility of 25-year-olds or whatever other sort of thing you imagine. So my point is that weaving in infant and child welfare and survival is absolutely essential to any understanding of changes in human violence, in major transitions such as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. It has to be, right? It just has to be according to our understanding of the evolution of life histories. And it seems to me that changes in the overall sort of environment of violence is probably quite related to the welfare of children. And thinking about that may give a little purchase theoretically for why this went about.
Okay, as I say, two very different questions. So taking them in order, I think your main point was that I paid too little attention to theories about the importance of sexual dimorphism in generating patriarchy, patriarchal violence, gender inequality, and so on. And I think you were citing the Jim Sidanius's work on social dominance order. And so my apologies. I ran through it in a couple of slides relatively quickly to make the point that that a number of people have indeed explored the importance of sexual dimorphism for patriarchy, and I think the general conclusion is, yeah, it's very important, but it's not an explanation for why it is that humans are so much more patriarchal in many ways than other animals. And the reason is because our degree of sexual dimorphism, although in bodily strength it's greater than in height and weight, is nevertheless not sufficient to account for the special features of human patriarchy. So I'll leave it at that, but my slides say a bit more than that. Okay, suddenly shift to maximal juvenile survival being critical as a feature of the human life history. So here is my ignorance of life history theory coming in to ask this question. Would that claim of the supreme importance of juvenile survival be true in a world in which the alpha male had 80% of the paternity in the group, or some very high proportion, which would decline with the increasing group size, but nevertheless would always be very significant?
Depends on the age pattern of reproduction, right? So that that fitness with respect to reproductive success, right? So fitness being the marginal rate of increase of your, a given allele or whatever, of your lineage with respect to the rest of the population, shows very strongly diminishing marginal returns to increasing fertility, right? So the most bang for the buck you get is actually the first one, right? And the second one is pretty good too. By the 80th, right, your marginal contribution to fitness is actually quite low. And a big part of that is because it takes time to have that many offspring, right? And so, well, yeah, it's better to have more than to have fewer. It's actually even better to time them right. And so a beta male with modest reproduction, but early in life, perhaps because he's sneaky or whatever, is good at forming coalitions, can actually do better than someone who has a ton of offspring. And this happened. This is a result of the fact that we have overlapping generations, right? And so, and the reason for everybody else here, everybody else but me, who's not a population biologist, right? The reason that overlapping generations matter is because over time, your offspring getting in the game, it's like compound interest, right? Getting in the game is more important because down the line, you have more generations of descendants because of your early entry into the market, as it were, right? So, yeah, the devil's in the details with life history theory, right? So
what you're saying is a fine encouragement to further thinking about these issues, you know, and a robust reminder to me that the story is incomplete, and you know that this is a story in early days. I think it's you know, I think it's got an exciting prospects, and I think although Richard is worried about the archaeological testability, I think I very much appreciate Lisa's point that we can go beyond the archaeological. There may be ways in which we can test it, as we talked about, but I think there are many other ways in which we can test it and in which we can refine models in exactly the kind of way that you're talking about.
Okay, with that, I just want to conclude with a few words of thanks. So first, thanks to everyone who joined us in person. This is the first in-person event that the Center for Ethics and Society has had in 2 years. So I want to express my gratitude to everyone for their willingness to participate in person, as well as to the hybrid webinar audience that has joined. I'd like to thank, in particular, Professor Wrangham for delivering the Tanner lectures this year, the discussants, Professor Gordon, Professor Lloyd, and then our discussants today, Professor Klein and Professor Morris. And I'd like finally just to thank the staff of the Center for Ethics and Society, who has been the host for the 3 days of events. Without you, we couldn't do this in the manner in which this has happened, in difficult circumstances with a whole deal of uncertainty about exactly how things would be pulled off. So with that, would you please join me in thanking everyone involved?